Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Okay, we're going to dive right into things today because we are exploring a deeply human theme, the control paradox. It's this incredibly counterintuitive reality that the more absolute control you try to grab onto in life, the less you actually have. It sounds crazy, right? But to truly gain influence and stability, you almost always have to do the exact opposite of what your instincts are screaming at you to do. Basically, you have to let it go.
Think about holding a handful of completely dry sand. If you hold it gently, just resting in an open palm, it stays right there. It's fine. But what happens when you panic? What happens when you squeeze that sand as tightly as you possibly can just to make absolutely sure not a single grain escapes? Well, the pressure instantly forces the sand out between your tightly clenched fingers, until you open your hand and realize you're left with almost nothing. Human psychology, and really human influence in general, works in the exact same paradoxical way.
So, let's set the stage. Act 1.
The context.
This tension we're talking about, it is wired deeply into some of our oldest stories. Just look at the ancient biblical account in John 18, where we see two entirely different approaches to a massive crisis. On one hand, you have Peter. He's standing by a charcoal fire in a courtyard, and he is just operating on pure self-reliance and fear. He frantically tries to control his own safety by denying he even knows Jesus. But contrast that panicked, white-knuckled denial with Jesus himself, who faces the high priest and the authorities with this quiet, confident surrender to a higher purpose. He doesn't fight the reality of the moment, he just calmly speaks the truth.
And that brings us to a really brilliant little insight from our newsletter's author, Papa Ya, who shared a quote from his daughter, Emily. It simply reads, "Overthinking is under-trusting God." So the crucial point here is that relying purely on our own strength, over-managing our circumstances to try and force a specific outcome, it's a fundamentally flawed strategy. It just leaves us exhausted and vulnerable. Whether you're looking at this through a lens of faith or strictly through human psychology, the illusion that we are entirely in charge is a trap.
Let's bring this into the modern day and see how it plays out in psychology, especially when it comes to parenting or managing a team at work. When parents or bosses rely on really rigid oversight, guilt, or just constantly looking over someone's shoulder, they aren't actually gaining control. All they're doing is manufacturing a short-term illusion of compliance. Decades of research grounded in self-determination theory shows us that this kind of micromanagement totally sacrifices long-term trust. It breeds secrecy, workarounds, and emotional distance. True influence comes from setting clear boundaries and then having the courage to step back to foster genuine cooperation.
Papa actually has a great take on this in the newsletter. He reflects on working under those stifling bosses who just watched his every single move. And we've all been there, right? That intense scrutiny just kills bold ideas. It forces everybody on the team to play it safe. If you want to help a team truly soar, you have to grant them the freedom to fail. Just like a young bird, you eventually have to nudge them out of the safety of the nest. If you hold them too tightly, they are never going to learn how to fly.
Moving right along to Act 2, the tension.
Now, you might be wondering, how does this paradox scale up to the global stage? Well, political scientist Milan Zvolik captures this perfectly. Authoritarian regimes, think of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia or the Soviet Union, they often completely dismantle civil liberties and rely on raw, unfiltered brutality. But here is the paradox at a massive scale. That brutality is actually a symptom of deep systemic insecurity. It is absolutely not strength. Without independent courts or legitimate elections to balance power, these dictators are constantly terrified of both the general public and their own inner circles.
Let's actually walk through the inevitable life cycle of a regime built entirely on fear. It always starts with paranoia. In year one, because the ruler is so insecure, they systematically start driving out competent, independent truth-tellers. By year 3, you see these brutal purges, replacing actual experts with subservient sycophants. By year 5, the ruler is living in a total echo chamber of curated praise, this absolute illusion of power. And because they are entirely disconnected from reality at that point, they inevitably make catastrophic blunders. Fast forward to year 10, and you're looking at total institutional collapse. The iron fist literally blinds the very hand that wields it.
Scholar Gene Sharp actually coined a brilliant term for exactly how this collapse triggers. He calls it political jujitsu. It's the paradox of repression. When a super insecure, heavily armed regime unleashes disproportionate violence against peaceful, non-violent demonstrators, like we saw historically in Amritsar or Selma, it backfires completely. The moral balance flips in an instant. The sheer violence shocks onlookers into resistance. It alienates the regime's allies, and it totally shatters any remaining authority they had.
The harder they squeeze, the faster they fall.
All right, let's bring this back home to us. Act 3, the connection.
So how do we actually resolve this tension in our own often chaotic lives? Well, we can start with ancient Taoist philosophy. Chapter 48 of the Tao Te Ching tells us that to master the way, we have to drop our absolute compulsion to control everything. Quote, by letting it go, it all gets done. It's profound wisdom. And as Papa points out in the newsletter, it sounds an awful lot like that famous anthem from Disney's Frozen. I mean, think about it. When Elsa finally stops suppressing her innate power and just lets it go, she finds harmony. Progress in life rarely comes from frantic force.
There's actually a formal term for this concept. It's called Wu Wei. It translates to the art of non-action, or effortless alignment with the natural order. Now wait, this absolutely does not mean being lazy or passive. Not at all. It is the quiet, highly intentional discipline of knowing exactly when to release your grip. It's understanding when your constant interference is just creating more friction and having the wisdom to step aside and let the world turn on its own natural momentum.
Picture yourself trying to push a massive, heavy boulder up a really steep hill. You are just exhausting yourself, fighting against gravity and reality itself. Now compare that feeling to floating down a powerful river. You're still moving, you're still navigating and steering, but you are allowing the current to do the heavy lifting. When we stop trying to overpower our circumstances and instead align ourselves with them, that natural momentum carries the weight for us.
And yet, we are constantly surrounded by these little illusions that tempt us right back into micromanaging. Think about the iOS control center on your smartphone. It's a literal dashboard of toggles and sliders designed to make us feel like we are the absolute masters of our digital universe. But get this, a really fascinating Carnegie Mellon study found that giving users this illusion of digital control actually makes them lower their guard. Because they feel so in control of their settings, they end up sharing more sensitive data and becoming way more vulnerable. The interface makes us feel incredibly secure, when in reality, we're totally exposed.
So how do we break the habit? In a TEDx talk, risk professional Connor Hogan shared this brilliant, highly practical 3-step framework for catching ourselves right in the act of overmanaging. Step 1, notice. Just notice when you're tensing up and trying to force an outcome. Step 2, pause. Literally stop your frantic action in its tracks. And step 3, anchor. Anchor yourself in the present reality rather than that idealized future you are desperately trying to script out. It's a daily practice of intentionally stepping back.
Which brings us to our conclusion, the synthesis.
We have traveled everywhere from ancient scripture to the UI design of modern smartphones today. So here are your 3 core takeaways to weave it all together. Number 1, set clear boundaries, but do not try to force specific outcomes. Create the right environment and just let things grow organically. Number 2, focus your energy on building genuine trust instead of constantly monitoring and surveilling the people around you. And number 3, practice the discipline of acceptance. True stability is achieved not by tightening your grip, but by letting go of the illusion that you dictate every single detail.
Which perfectly lines up with Papa's closing dad joke for the week. He says, "People ask how I stay in such complete control of my golf game. Simple. I decide ahead of time that I want the ball in the woods." It's a funny, lighthearted reminder, but honestly, a really profound one. When you accept reality exactly as it is, rather than fighting it tooth and nail, you suddenly find yourself completely at peace with the outcome.
And that leaves us with one final, kind of provocative question to consider today. Look at your own relationships, your leadership style, or even just your personal goals. Where in your own life are you squeezing the sand a little too tightly? What would actually happen if you just took a deep breath, opened your hand, and let the current carry you for a while? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I'll see you next time.